Hi, my name is Bill Browder, and I'm very honored and pleased to be presenting today at the Justice and Anti-Corruption Reforms Forum. I thought it would be useful for me to share a little bit of my story because this feeds into why the work you're all doing is so important. I'm known for many things, but the thing that I'm most known for is something called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act was named after my Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered in Russian police custody on November 16, 2009. Sergei was murdered because he uncovered a $230 million Russian government corruption scheme in which a number of organized criminals and Russian government officials together stole $230 million from the Russian government of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government in the previous year. Sergei was my lawyer. He exposed the corruption, the scheme. He was then arrested by some of the principal actors in this scheme. He was put in pretrial detention. He was tortured for 358 days. And he was killed, as I mentioned, on November 16, 2009 at the age of 37. And for me, his murder was one of the most traumatic and upsetting things that could ever happen. And I went on a mission to get justice for Sergei. And at first I tried to get justice inside of Russia. And as you might imagine, there was no appetite for that at all. They circled the wagons. Putin personally got involved in covering up the murder. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And in the most shocking miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial after they killed him in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. It became obvious that we couldn't get any justice inside of Russia. So I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And that's when I came up with this idea of the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation which freezes the assets and bans the visas of kleptocrats and human rights violators from Russia. I proposed this in Washington in 2010, and I got the backing of Senator Benjamin Cardin. He was a Democrat from Maryland, and Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona. And they came up as the sponsors of the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act was ultimately passed in December of 2012. Vladimir Putin went out of his mind in response to the Magnitsky Act. Vladimir Putin is a man who commits terrible human rights abuses for money. He's accumulated more money than perhaps any other world leader. And he values money more than human life. And all of a sudden, his money was potentially at risk in the West. He retaliated by banning the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He made repealing the Magnitsky Act his single largest foreign policy priority. And then he went after me, chasing me around the world with death threats, kidnapping threats, 8 Interpol arrest warrants, extradition requests, etc. And so it's clear that we had found Putin's Achilles heel. There are now not just the United States, but Canada has a Magnitsky Act, the UK has a Magnitsky Act, the EU has a Magnitsky Act, Australia, Canada, etc. There's now 35 countries with Magnitsky Acts around the world, and it's turned out to be one of the most valuable new legislative tools for fighting kleptocracy and human rights abuse. It no longer just applies to Russia, it also applies to other rogue regimes. China has now been sanctioned for the Uyghur genocide. Officials in Nicaragua, Venezuela, various other places who do terrible things have also been sanctioned. The second main area that we worked on to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and this is what's particularly relevant for this gathering today, is looking for who got the money. how did the $230 million flow, and where did it go to? And for 10 years, I, together with my colleague Vadim Kleiner, who's actually at your conference today, have been working on finding out who got the money. And over a 10-year period, we figured out who got the money, and where did it go to, and how did it go? And particularly relevant for this conference today is that a lot of the money, the first stop was Moldova. The money went to Moldova, and then from Moldova it went to places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Cyprus, and then on to what we call destination countries like France, the UK, United States, where the money was used to purchase high-end real estate and other luxury goods. And so as we were looking for the money, we had one very big discovery in addition to the Moldova discovery, which is that a lot of the money, first in Moldova, but then second, the first major Western port of call was Danske Bank in Estonia. I'm sure many of you will remember the Danske Bank scandal. What we discovered was that 200 million of the $230 million of stolen tax money was laundered through Danske Bank through their Estonian branch. Now, whenever we find money going to any of these countries, we file criminal complaints. And we filed criminal complaints in Estonia against Danske Bank. And when we do file criminal complaints, they often get a lot of media attention. And this one for sure did. And because of this media attention, we ended up getting a call from a journalist in Copenhagen working for the Berlingske newspaper. And they told us that they had just gotten a huge data leak from Danske Bank. And the data leak was very interesting, but they didn't know how to figure out what was what in this huge data leak. They didn't know what was dirty money or clean money or whatever. But they contacted us and they said, could you hand over your information about the Magnitsky case? And then we can look at the accounts and we can look at the routing and we can look at all different other information and try to make some sense of this huge data leak that we had. And so we handed over our information. And what we ended up getting back was a few days later, they ran our information through their database. They said it wasn't just 200 million of dirty money from Russia flowing through Danske Bank. From your information, they told us, and from their own data leak, they were able to determine that it was $8.3 billion of dirty money flowed through Danske Bank. Now, Denmark is a country which prides itself on its integrity and honesty. It's ranked number 2 in the world by Transparency International as the second most transparent and honest country. And the CEO of the bank couldn't just let it stand that there was a major newspaper reporting $8.3 billion of dirty money flowing through their bank. And so they had to bring in an external accounting firm, an external law firm, an external data analysis firm to figure out what the real situation was. And they did their analysis, and they came back about a year later, and they said it wasn't $8.3 billion that was laundered through Danske Bank. It was $232 billion laundered through Danske Bank. It's a shocking number. And what's even more shocking in my mind is that this amount of money was what we were able to determine when we could lift the hood on one medium-sized Scandinavian bank. So if we were able to do the same exercise at Raiffeisen in Vienna, which we can't do, or Deutsche Bank or UBS in Switzerland, or Credit Suisse and UBS in Switzerland, and Deutsche Bank in Germany, ABN AMRO, I think we would come up with a number close to $1 trillion of money stolen from the Russian people and laundered through all these Western banks. And what makes this so important for the world is that the money that was stolen was money that should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and public services. Instead, was spent on private jets and yachts and villas in the south of France. And as time goes on, the amount of money was so large, $1 trillion, that Putin had himself a terrible dilemma, which is that at some point, the Russian people were going to come for him. He didn't know what that point would be, but he knew that eventually, if everybody is in destitute poverty and a few people are living in absolute luxury, the whole system is going to come undone. And so Putin didn't wait for that moment to happen. He decided to try to preempt that. How did he preempt it? Well, straight out of Machiavelli, he finds a foreign enemy and starts a war. And that's what the war in Ukraine is all about. It's not about NATO enlargement. It's not about destiny of the Russian Empire. This was about a little man who's stolen too much money and is afraid of his own people. And this is why the investigation into dirty money, the reform of the banking system so that this can't happen again, and Moldova's role in this is so important, because it's not just about dirty money, it's about world peace. And if these loopholes get closed, it means that it's not just about law enforcement, it's about potentially preventing a humanitarian disaster. And that's why this is so important. That's why there's a lot of work to be done in Moldova, and I'm very glad to have an opportunity to share this story with you, and hopefully some reform will come from these conversations, this conference, and this agenda. Thank you very much.